And every one of those conferences, in every conference I've been to so far this year, there has been a thread of security leaders asking the question how they can get heard in the boardroom. And my response to that is that, you know, security leaders need to put down the crayons because security leaders are still marching into the boardroom with their red, yellow, and green crayons, and they're going up to argue for budget against people who come in with financial models of either the risk they'll reduce from that budget or the revenue they'll increase with that budget. And you can't argue for funding against others who are showing up with financial models if you show up with crayons.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Risk Management Show podcast, where we explore the pressing challenges and strategic innovation in the risk and compliance space. I am your host, Boris Agranovich, and today our guest is David White. David is a president and co-founder at Axio, which is a leading provider of cyber risk quantification solutions. With over 2 decades of experience in cyber insurance, risk quantification, and cybersecurity frameworks, David is at the forefront of helping critical infrastructure and enterprise organizations build true cyber resilience. So, David, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of your framework for embedding cyber resilience into risk governance, investment planning, and decision making. But before that, David, could you tell us a short story about yourself, your career path, and what you guys at Axio are up to these days?
Oh, sure. Okay, short story. Um, give me a pause for just a moment. Well, look, I as a university student, I studied civil engineering with a double major in engineering and public policy, and part of that curriculum was included building financial justifications for major capital projects. And so even from very early in school, I started out thinking about, how to make a financial argument. And so maybe it's no accident that I end up co-founding a company that provides cyber risk quantification solutions. Look, in the middle part of my career, I had a fantastic opportunity to work as a cybersecurity researcher at the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute CERT division. And there I led a team that built and helped organizations implement a model called the CERT Resilience Management Model, which was a formal um, maturity model built on the architecture of the capability maturity model integration, CMMI, that addressed operational risk as the umbrella for cybersecurity. So it was really about operational resilience. And I co-authored a book with my colleagues Richard Corelli and Julia Allen on that model, and worked with a lot of organizations implementing it. And then in 2012, I was invited by the U.S. Department of Energy to serve as chief architect for the creation of a model that became known as the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, or C2M2. And I collaborated in that project with Samara Moore at the Department of Energy. And Samara then went on to the White House as the lead from the White House on the development of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So there's a little bit of that's a story arc that I think most people, most of your audience may recognize at least the final endpoint on that. But it was a fantastic journey. And then after that, I met Scott Canry, my co-founder at Axio, and we decided that there wasn't at that moment a really good way for security leaders and risk leaders to make sound, financially informed decisions about where to invest to best reduce the organization's risk. And that's when we started building Axio.
Mhm. Fantastic. So, David, you worked in the higher sphere, as you described, in the across energy, healthcare, and also even help people to propel in this the administration. What are some of the common gaps you see when organizations try to move from prevention to true cyber resilience?
Well, I think that one of the very common themes that I have observed is an overconfidence in preparedness for an event. This is something that a friend of mine, Dr. Manuel Hepfer from the University of Oxford, described as the preparedness paradox as part of his CEO research. Manuel is a cybersecurity researcher at Oxford. And he discovered in his research that there was an inverse relationship between an organization's sense of preparedness and their actual preparedness when they suffered a major event. And I have observed this in my own. I didn't come up with a clever name like he did, but I now use his name because I do think that there is some overconfidence in the cybersecurity world about preparedness for major events. And I believe that at least that stems in part from a lack of understanding of the potential impact from an event and the amount of time and resources that will be required to recover from a major event. And I think that's supported by skepticism. There's still this sense, I think, in our community of, well, it's not going to happen to me, and I think even CISOs and risk leaders who know that it's possible that it happened to their organization have to deal with that on a daily basis from their colleagues and the employee population at their organization of this sort of skepticism about the risk. And I think that's what contributes to this overconfidence in our preparedness, which also leads, I believe, to some uh, some misalignment we have observed. That's often the case in the risk that an organization is exposed to and the insurance portfolio they invest in to offset that risk, which is another problem that we work on at Axio.
Mhm. All right. So you advocate for a resilience-first approach to cybersecurity. Can you perhaps walk us through the steps that you identified? I believe 6 steps, and why each is essential for long-term risk management.
Yeah. Um, so the first step is really to strengthen fundamentals, cybersecurity fundamentals. Like our research and lots of other researchers have reported that organizations are still missing some of the fundamentals. I think this was recently highlighted in a report I read from Cisco Talos that reported that identity attacks are very much on the rise over the past 12 months, which suggests that organizations are still missing some key um, strength in managing identity and access management, and those are fundamentals. Fundamentals matter because it is the foundation of everything that we do from both a prevention side of risk and a response side of risk. Those fundamentals matter. So we have to start by strengthening the foundation or the fundamentals of our cybersecurity program. I think it's as step two, we advocate identifying and evaluating high impact scenarios like ransomware, data breaches, OT disruption events, and so forth that continue to sting large organizations. I can't imagine that organizations would be caught as flat-footed as we're seeing some organizations be caught if they had actually taken time to assess and model the potential impact from these very common events that you see others suffering. Step three is then to quantify those, and this step two and three kind of blend together. First, you know, evaluate, identify the scenarios, but we're at Axio very strong proponents of estimating the quantifying the estimated financial losses from these real world threats. Um, and this happens. There are lots of techniques. You can use our techniques. You can use other techniques, but we very strongly advocate an impact focused approach. Look, I think probability certainly also matters, but um, as long as probability is non-zero, an organization can only be resilient if it is able to endure the impact. And so for any non-zero probability for a major disruptive event, we really need to understand the impact to make sure that our organization can withstand the impact and live to fight another day. And that's where impact-centric quantification really matters, um, which can then be the output of which can be used to support step four, which is to prioritize investments in both prevention and recovery strategies. So the left of boom controls that are typically probability reducers, and the right of boom controls that are recovery accelerators and impact reducers. And optimizing an organization's investment between those two categories, very high level categories of controls, is something that comes quite naturally from financial modeling of an event. And then, of course, you that leads quickly to step five, which is to optimize and make those investments. Um, and then six, to really build a culture of resilience across the enterprise by embedding resilience-based decisions. Now, in my experience, one of the very best ways to work on the resilience culture across an enterprise is through exercise, realistic exercise, tabletop exercises. They don't have to be that lengthy or even that expensive, but they are very important in in giving an organization some muscle memory of what it would look like if they had a bad day and how they would get themselves up, brush themselves off, and live to fight another day. That muscle memory comes only from exercises and culture comes from the things we do over and over again. And so having that commitment to persistent conversation about risk and what risk would look like to the organization and how the organization would respond to risk, and actually evidencing that through some tabletop activities is a really effective way, in my experience, to build a strong resilience culture.
All right, fantastic. So most important is to have a framework, specifically framework that is based on the experience and people have a good feeling with it. And can you perhaps elaborate some regarding your thoughts regarding the events such as Colonial Pipeline and Clorox about this consequences of these events? Perhaps what lessons should organizations draw from these incidents, and especially in terms of response and recovery?
Yeah. Um, so I think, I'm a very curious guy. So I've I pay close attention to high profile events like these, and the those two events, well, we know that Colonial Pipeline was ransomware, and it was ransomware on the IT side of the house. The ransomware did not penetrate the OT side of the house, but Colonial, in their words, shut down the OT operation out of an abundance of caution. On the Clorox side, the event was also an IT event, not an OT attack. Clorox would never confirm publicly that it was ransomware, but many of us believe that it was ransomware because from outside the organization, it certainly had the appearance of ransomware. Look, Colonial was back up in 5 days, but they kept an incident response team in place for 11 months. 11 months. Um, with an economic impact that estimates are around or slightly more than $100 million. Clorox restored operation in 6 to 7 weeks. So it took them far longer to restore operations than Colonial Pipeline. They kept their incident response team in place for 12 months. So it's interesting as you compare these events that the incident response teams were in action for 12 months to make complete recovery from the event. On the Clorox case, we believe the impact to be around $400 million, so quite a bit more than in Colonial, probably because they were down for longer. It took them 6 to 7 weeks to stand up. So, and to go back to the comment I made earlier on insurance recoveries, look, there was a headline in my the cybersecurity newsletter I get from the Wall Street Journal every morning. There was a headline earlier this week reporting that Clorox returned to profitability for the first time since the event just last quarter. And part of the reason they returned to profitability is because they finally um, closed out their insurance claim and they received the proceeds from their cyber insurance program. And so,
Mm.
once again, it points to the importance of having that financial backstop in place to help protect the organization. Look, if we look, so we looked at, those are some commonalities from my understanding and analysis of those events. If if we think about what kind of lessons we can all draw from these events, neither organization, it's it seems very clear to me that neither organization understood the full scope of their IT and OT interdependencies. Um, and this is something that I also find is a common thread in my work with organizations. Very few organizations that have a substantial OT footprint have done at least a tabletop exercise where they sever IT, take away the IT um, estate, and evaluate very carefully and very thoughtfully what the effect would be on the OT side of the house. And because increasingly organizations are building out their OT systems so that there are a lot of dependencies on IT. Those can come from things like production planning systems or even shipping and logistics systems that live on the IT side of the house, but without which OT comes to a screeching halt because, you know, if you can't ship product, you there's no point in having it roll off the end of the assembly line because you might be making the wrong thing, right? And so without those production planning systems and shipping and logistics systems, it can be very difficult to keep OT operations in place, even if the attack has not directly impacted OT systems. So big takeaway for me from these events and from some other recent events is we all need to do a better job at understanding the intricacies and subtleties of those interdependencies between the IT estate and the OT estate, if you will. And I think this was also highlighted for me recently in the SANS, the training organization, does
Mhm.
an annual study. In the study they published earlier this year, they reported that OT disruption events were up dramatically year over year, but 58% of those OT disruption events were IT only events, which suggests that those organizations didn't really understand their interdependencies. And so, um, once again, I'm going to point to tabletop exercises and risk analysis as ways for us to get our heads around what um, what a bad day on the IT side looks like from the OT, because OT for organizations that depend on it is really the that's the that's the breadwinner of the organization. That's the revenue engine. Um,
Mm.
and we saw that in Colonial and in Clorox.
Let's talk about cyber risk quantification that you kind of specialize in, your company specializes in. How does quantifying potential financial losses from ransomware or other threats change how leaders prioritize cybersecurity investments?
So I believe if I had to summarize that in a very short soundbite, it would be it gives confidence, clarity, and justification. Um, the And I've seen over, this year, and I've been acutely aware as I've been to a number of conferences so far this year, and every one of those conferences, in every conference I've been to so far this year, there has been a thread of security leaders asking the question how they can get heard in the boardroom. And my
Mhm.
response to that is that, you know, the security leaders need to put down the crayons because security leaders are still marching into the boardroom with their red, yellow, and green crayons, and they're going up to argue for budget against people who come in with financial models of either the risk they'll reduce from that budget or the revenue they'll increase with that budget. And you can't argue for funding against others who are showing up with financial models if you show up with crayons. And so, um, cyber risk quantification very dramatically matures the C-suite and board level conversations about cyber risk, about risk tolerance, and about cybersecurity investments, both in protective controls and resilience or responsive controls. I also think that it matures CISOs and security leaders to in their own career maturity to help take them out of this uh, boiler room persona where they are often treated by organizations as just these are the folks that we count on to buy and operate the tools to keep us safe and secure, right? And turns them into business leaders who can actually speak to the business risk that cyber threats bring. Because as you know, Boris, cyber risk is business risk. I'm sure many of your listeners also are quite aware of that, but I don't know of another way to more effectively communicate that in your conversations with the C-suite and board than by walking in with a financial model of the risk.
Mhm. All right. So, David, I would like to ask you your personal point of view. What are the major misconceptions in the field of cybersecurity space that you actually busy with that you kind of strongly disagree with?
Misconceptions that it's purely a technical issue. It's not a technical issue. It's a business issue. And I know yeah, it's I think most mature CISOs are well aware of that. I think um, another thing that I'm observing recently actually came from uh, a client of ours at Axio actually opened my eyes to this when we had trained them and equipped them with the systems to model cyber risks. So they're building financial models of cyber risk and managing a portfolio of risks that matter to that organization's operations. And then one day I check in with them and they're modeling physical sabotage. They're modeling wildfire risk. They're modeling, all sorts of other operational risks. And I was like, well, when did this happen? They were like, well, these risks are really important to the organization. They're really important to the company. And so we decided to try out the same techniques on these risks. And it's actually gotten us a lot of traction with enterprise risk management because they now see that they're now seeing cyber as an operational risk and one of many operational risks that our team, because we have an intimate understanding of the organization's operations, can be valuable in helping them better understand, right? And so it really did give them taking off those cyber blinders gave that team a much better listening at the enterprise risk management table because then they became kind of operational risk experts. So increasingly, I'm now starting to think of, the market calls it cyber risk quantification or CRQ. I'm really starting to think of it as just RQ, risk quantification. And um, maybe the first step from CRQ to expand to RQ is to look at operational risks. But I think that's it's an important it's an important misconception for us to start defeating that, somehow cyber is so different, right? It's just another operational risk. And I think the more we treat it as another operational risk, the more uh, plausible our arguments become and the more respected we become as risk leaders in an organization.
Mm, fantastic. So, David, if we summarize our interview for someone who's listening in, and they would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would it be?
Um, Exercise. Run an exercise, especially if your organization is dependent on OT. Run a tabletop exercise where you take the IT estate away and carefully evaluate what happens to OT, what happens to the organization's ability to produce revenue from the OT side. Um, Understand the potential financial impact of risks that matter to the organization. Do that using financial modeling. You can start that journey toward risk quantification by gathering some colleagues together and spending an hour or two at the whiteboard and start to sketch out impacts from a key risk as you walk through what it would look like. Think of it almost as a micro tabletop of, okay, let's suppose we've had a ransomware event. What are we going to spend money on that we wouldn't have otherwise spent? And where are we going to fail to earn money that we otherwise would have earned as a company? And just starting to have those conversations can make a big difference in the perception of risk.
Mm, fantastic. So, David, that's were all my questions. If I forgot to ask you something that is important to our audience, please go ahead and do it.
Well, I can't overemphasize the importance of financial modeling and also evaluating the organization's insurance investments because the bottom line on resilience for any organization is whether it can afford to live and fight another day. And that is a financial measure. So as you start your journey toward resilience, keep that in mind and make sure that you're leveraging all the tools you have at your disposal, protective controls, responsive controls, and financial controls like insurance that will help shore up your balance sheet if you have that bad day.
All right, fantastic, David. Thank you very much, and I hope we will cooperate with your company in the future because it's a huge topic that you guys are busy with, and we just touched only a small part of it. And I wish you great success to your company, Axio, and speak to you next time.
Boris, thank you very much.
Thank you.